Interior Design, Design Communications 1, Design Graphics, Orthographic Projections, Elevation Drawings. Please take note of the terms and vocabulary that are listed here. Also, please take a look at what the textbook says these terms are about. We will be using this information in the lecture and in the assignments. So let's start with the discussion of elevations. In general, these drawings are just another group of orthographic projections. They tend to emphasize the exterior and exposed surfaces of an object, and they are generally viewed viewed perpendicular to the picture plane. These elevations are nice in that they help us because they're similar to what we see in real life, not exactly the same, but similar. And so it's easier for us to understand the elevation because it has similarities to those things that we see in real life. As a result, the objects are generally placed upright and they're presented in a way that makes sense, and that is true to our normal way of viewing things. Unfortunately, they do not give us much information about depth, and there are some specific challenges that occur with curvilinear and oblique conditions. So as a result, not everything can be shown in elevation drawings. These elevation drawings, as mentioned, are primarily used for exterior conditions. These are just part of the set of information that is part of the multi-view drawings, and they are projected orthographically in such a way that as to represent the object within a picture plane. We talked about this in an earlier lecture where we said if you look through your smartphone or you look through a picture or through a camera lens, you're going to get that picture plane view. So it is a way of creating a framework around and including the thing represented. So as a result, these building elevations try to illustrate the conditions of the outside of the building as they appear to the viewer. They also tend to represent just vertical surfaces, or not. There's not underside of roof, and there's not, the top view. This is simply a vertical view of that facade. And importantly, what then becomes an aspect of these drawings is that the silhouette or the building's form in terms of outline and profile become very important. Many objects are recognizable by their general shape, and as a result, these types of things give the viewer a cue as to what the object is about. And as we get even more detailed, we start to look at specific parts like doors and windows and porches and things like that. And we look at material placement. So those all add to the context and the depth of information surrounding a building and its design. The elevation has some important aspects to consider when we're thinking about how we orient our viewer to it. So the position and orientation become important. As I mentioned, it is as viewed through a picture plane, so it's important to keep that in mind. The great thing about this is that we can use very similar tools that we used in the plan drawings and the section drawings, and that is that we're using scale, size, proportion, all those things to match up. So the same scale for the plan is the same scale for the section, which is the same scale for the elevations. These all become interrelated and help us to kind of put the parts together of this multi-view drawing. So the things that are challenging are those curved and oblique surfaces, because they don't want to behave quite the same way when it comes to the parallel positioning in the picture plane. And so that becomes a little bit challenging and doesn't necessarily fall by the rules. There's opportunity to create distortion or a misrepresentation with these forms, so they need to be handled rather carefully. The elevation is by its very nature an exterior element. So the site and its surroundings become very, very important. And so we can describe the object or the building, depending on what we're illustrating, with more representation from by telling people what's around it. And so that becomes important. The elevations, the site sections, both have a reliance, just as the section drawing did, on that very heavy ground mass line, that heavy line that's placed at the bottom of the object to identify where it connects to the ground. So that ground line needs to have weight, and it's a way of us understanding what its orientation is. We know it's connected to terra firma some way. So as a result, these relationships, as we've talked about, all help us to kind of fold together a better understanding of the object, not just the object itself, but what is adjacent to it, and what forms and functions does it support as it's in its presence. So the orientation also has a lot to say to the designer about how we arrange things. And so it becomes very important to understand that the arrangement of the elevations has a lot to do with how understandable it is by the viewer. This information it can be formatted in a variety of different ways. And so the slide that's provided here gives you a little bit of context and content in terms of that arrangement orientation subject. The object on the left, or the series of objects on the left, take a kind of a plan view orientation bias in the drawing. And so what we're seeing is what would happen is if the walls kicked out from the plan and were all oriented with the roof as being the primary connection point. These are all fine, but it's harder for clients to understand this because they have to twist their viewpoints into these different 90-degree positions. So these aren't the best way to draw things, in my opinion. I've done them. I find my clients get a little bit confused by them. The other way that we consider these is by providing label information that tells folks what and where the orientation is on the elevation. So the simple notation of north, south, east, west are very, very helpful because it gives us a bearing and orientation that we can compare to a plan with. So if you look at the bottom, we start to get into that a little bit. In a similar way, that bottom illustration looks at each elevated element independently, and so it starts to show maybe the relationships of those elevations to each other in a sequential way. Now, the challenge on this is that it takes a little bit of a puzzle in your mind to put these together. And so they provide lines, horizontal lines, to show the connection points. And again, not a bad way to represent things. Many drawings will do this as a way of completing the full representation of the exterior elevations, but it does it does have some drawbacks. The next and last group that we're looking at here has kind of a what I want to call it like a skin or a shell approach, where you're somewhat peeling back sequentially the outside elements of the building in such a way that we can see more than one relationship to a elevation at one time. And this method is very helpful in seeing how the parts go together, but can represent some confusion as they tend to want to represent more of a paraline elevation or set of elevations. In this discussion more than we, or more about this, then we want to consider exactly where are the orientation coming from in terms of north, south, east, west, the major compass directions. And by keeping those in play, they becomes very helpful in folks understanding, because they can view it from the context of a site plan or from a building plan and understand where north is and how north, south, east, west are affected by that orientation. And in a similar way, using a clockwise sequence, which is kind of what we're looking at in that bottom section again, is just another way of telling people that the elevations are connected to each other, just like, hours on a clock. The title information is important. I suggest that, you be thoughtful about, the order in which you place it, which kind of leads us down to the last representation, which is kind of an orientation based on bias. And what I mean by bias is I mean that there are some parts of the building that are important and some parts of the building that might be less important. So using those main features or those main frontages as a way of guiding the viewer into the important parts of the object are a helpful way of kind of leading them through the design itself. So think about, what might be an important feature or important orientation to place first or prominently in those elevations. So we've talked about scale in the past, and I won't spend much more time to say that, small scale, small detail, not a lot. Large detail, more detail. It's important. So the small detail stuff and the large detail stuff are kind of married in a certain sense by using people to represent, a scale. Once a person sees some sort of person representation, they're much more comfortable projecting themselves and into that illustration and understanding how big things are, how proportionate they are, and what the human interaction is more likely to be. So as a result, I encourage people to use these anthropomorphic representations so that they can illustrate scale a little easier. So another important part about material, about exterior elevations, it gives us a chance to do some material representations. And this is an opportunity of taking something that is very representative and trying to nudge it into the realm of realism. And so that the viewer can understand just a bit more than the general aspects of design. They can start to understand what materials are being used, what are the size and scale of those materials, what features like doors, windows, chimneys, all those elements, how do they actually go together, and as opposed to just being simple elemental forms. And down the road, these representations become very important in how construction occurs around the object. So as a result, the idea of a more expanded design description comes when we apply material representations to the elevations. So as we talked about earlier in this discussion, there are some ways of representing, graphic prominence and cueing to depth what is something close and what's far away. In this slide, we are really looking at the things that we should know by now, and that the prominent elements should be represented with heavy lines, and you can see the types of lines that are used there. The intermediate lines or object lines then have kind of a middle line weight that isn't as strong as the first or as light as a texture. And they help us to understand the content of the object. Often furniture or people would be represented as intermediate line weights. The light line weights are really reserved for those surface treatments. It is probably important to tell you that in the last slide we looked at material representations. Because of that, those really are textures, and those textures need to be lightly applied. If they're put on too heavy, it overwhelms the drawing and is difficult to read because there's just too much graphic information. So using light lines for those surface treatments is awesome, or is also very helpful. Now, those rules of depth that come in play is very simple, that the heavy lines are those closest to us, the light lines are the ones furthest away, and the intermediate ones are somewhere in the middle. And those are kind of represented in the illustration. You can see the drawing on the left has very little line weight applied to it. But then you start looking at what's going on the right side, and you can see far more delineation, more description occurring just by the application of those line weights. We also get to use different types of lines. So some of the lines are broken. They represent those lines very similarly to those represented in plan and sections, which may be hidden or phantom lines, lines that are behind a wall, or important elements that are above our view or below our view. So those are important. That heavy base line at the ground again helps us to anchor the drawing, and the light lines tend to give us some sense of context, what's beyond, what's surrounding the object, to give us a little bit of context information. As a result, we end up with what we call pictorial zones, and these help us discern distance and importance. So the foreground tends to be a little bit heavier, and that is using those heavy line weights, and they give us a real prominence, and they are used as we've talked about in the previous slide. The facade lines tend to be intermediate lines, and those are the surrounding objects that help us understand the use and function of the object, and maybe the context of people and other built objects around it. Using the light lines, then, we would be applying those distant outlines and frameworks that give us a sense of adjacent construction, or adjacent but maybe more distant cityscapes and elements like that. So just remember that those things that are closer up demand greater detail, and those things far away, little or no detail. And that's all I have to share with you in this lecture. Please refer to the assignment for additional information, and I will be sending along some additional information about this lesson and future lessons. Thank you, and have a great day.